Steve Kaufmann here. Today I'm going to talk about Russian, my experience with Russian, about how I learned the language, some comments about the language, and I'm going to begin by explaining a bit about Russia and Russian culture as I perceive it. I had mentioned in my video about learning French that the French like to be very logical, at least that's what they teach at school, and they like to be very precise in how they, explain themselves and so forth. The Japanese is not at all that way, and also there's a lot of understatement in Japanese. They don't say no, they say, we're going to certainly consider your suggestion, which means no. The Russians are not like that. The Russians say no. If it's no, they say no. They also very much like, all people generalize. But in Russia, there's no political correctness. There is just generalizations. They say anything. Что угодно, as they say in Russian. They'll say anything based on knowing the subject, not knowing the subject, getting the facts wrong. I hear this all the time on Echo Moskvi. The most amazing statements, but with tremendous drama and conviction. And so I'm going to do the same. I'm going to make very generalized statements about Russia and Russians without worrying too much about my facts. So, how did I get started? Well, I was about 60, and I had really two reasons for getting into Russian. One was that I had read, books by Dostoevsky and Tolstoy when I was 17, 18, and I thought it would be really cool to be able to read those books in the original. And the second thing was that, my approach to language learning is to de-emphasize grammar, not to ignore grammar, but to not put it up front, and to focus on exposing myself to the language through lots of listening and reading, and emphasizing really, noticing patterns rather than complicated grammar rules, explanations, and so forth. And I was sort of challenged and said, well, you can't do that with Russian because the grammar is too complicated. Okay, the grammar is very complicated. Russian is a difficult language. And to some extent, some people say no language is more difficult, blah, blah, blah. In fact, some languages are more difficult than others. It all depends on the language that you're starting from, of course. But for people without any background in Slavic languages, Russian is difficult. And I'm going to explain why. But before that, I'll talk a little bit about Russia. Russia is a phenomenal country. I mean, the scale, the size of Russia is mind-boggling. And if we go back in history, we'll see that, whatever it was, the Dutch dukedom or whatever it was, Muscovy, was this little area up in northern Russia where people of, I guess, a mixture of Slavic and, Finnish type people and Baltic type people and so forth, they were up there doing their thing. I can't remember whether they were actually conquered by the Mongol hordes who dominated, the Mongol Tartar hordes that dominated Russia for 300 years. I think they were, I can't remember, but whatever it was, the prince up there eventually defeated them. And so really the growth of Russia, even though there were people in the sort of area of what's now the Ukraine that were also Russians, and Kiev is called the mother of all Russian cities and so forth, but they were very much under the rule of the Mongols for 300 years. And so this Muscovy was up there and, interacting with Baltic countries and Germans and Swedes and stuff like that. And not very different, perhaps, other than that they spoke a different language, but culturally very much in that sphere. And from that, it expanded to the Pacific. From the moment they defeated the Mongols, within a few hundred years, they had expanded south, right down to the Caspian Sea. That expanded, I think they reached the Pacific in the late 1600s, and they only overthrew the Mongol yoke, as it's called, in the mid 1500s. Again, my history's far. You read it, you forget it, but roughly. So it has become this tremendous continental country. And so you're very much aware of this. And of course, subsequent to that, under Catherine the Great and other czars, they consolidated their hold on these Central Asian areas and Caucasus, and there was significant expansion in the 19th century, south and east. Tsarist Russia was very much an imperialist power. An imperialist power on somewhat weak legs because they expanded too quickly and they were defeated by the Japanese in 1905. And from that, the whole, largely because of the First World War, the Tsarist Empire collapsed and they had their revolution and became the Soviet Union. But all of that is still very international, with people from Central Asia, Turkic type people, the Caucasus with all of their different languages and cultures, some Islamic, some very early Christian and so forth. And of course they were always meddling in on the western side of their border, participating in the partition of Poland and chipping away at Romania and of course, so it's kind of been involved in all these different areas. So it's absolutely fascinating. And so that's one of the things you sense with Russia, that the scale is just huge. And even now, if I listen to Echo Moskvi, there are a lot of people there with Georgian names that are no longer Georgian. So even with the disintegration of the Soviet Empire, you're aware of these influences and now have a problem or whatever. There are issues with all the different minorities within Russia, plus immigration from countries in the former Soviet Union and stuff. So that's the world. It's very much a Eurasian world. And we have to understand that. They're not just like some European country that speaks a Slavic language. All right, that's by way of background. The language. It starts out with Zdravstvuyte. That's like hello. So in English we say hello. It's pretty easy to say. Zdravstvuyte. Okay? There's not a lot of vowels in there. And all they're saying is hello. You practice that in front of the mirror a few times. You got to clear the expectoration off the mirror. Just joking, by the way. Shutka, as they say in Russian. Of course, Czech has even fewer vowels. So I kind of think the Slavs, wherever they started from, somewhere on the plains of the Eurasian steppes there, they must have spent a lot of their time chewing sunflower seeds and spitting them out to arrive with a language that has so few vowels and so many things that you sort of say through your teeth and lips. And just joking, by the way. So, but it's an indication that the pronunciation is not easy. And there are a few little things that are kind of deceptive, like the O, if it's not stressed in a word, becomes A. So Toronto is Taronta, because the O becomes an A. So that makes the spelling a little bit difficult. So there are some issues with pronunciation, getting your tongue and lips around all these consonants and getting used to how the writing system works. On the subject of the writing system, compared to learning Chinese, it's easy. But in a way, it's not easy because it's very similar. I mean, it's a almost parallel alphabet to the Latin alphabet, which is not surprising because it comes from the Greek alphabet, and so does the Latin alphabet, which in turn comes from the Phoenician alphabet. But there are some letters that are unique to Russian, the zh, and then they have two characters that both are pronounced sh. I can't tell the difference, and I don't really know, and I've never worried about it. And they have a little B-flat sign, which is supposed to soften the sounds and stuff. So there's a few little things in there that you have to get used to. But there are some letters that look like Latin letters, and in fact, they're pronounced differently. Like what looks like a P is actually an R. And since it's very much hardwired in our minds that that's a P, it takes a while to get over that. It takes a while, but it eventually happens. So the only advice on the alphabet is to get started on it. You're going to be able to start reading with difficulty within a few hours, and then the more you read, the better you get at it. However, as I found when I went to Czech, it's always easier to read in your own alphabet, always. So that is always going to be a bit of a thing that makes Russian just that little bit more difficult. The other thing that's difficult in Russian, I'm not going to go through all the different, how the language works. Obviously, word order is an issue. Word order in Russian is very flexible and very different in some ways. You can say, what could be, okay, this is a book in English. The Russians don't worry about articles. Это книга. This book. Это книга. To ask, if you say, I read a book, a book, я читаю книгу. But you can also say, я книгу читаю, so that the word order can kind of be shifted around. And that's possible because, and I should add, to a lot of their questions, you only can tell it's a question by the intonation. If you say, у вас есть means you have, means to you is, у вас есть книга, you have a book. У вас есть книга? Question. They don't want to get into the French qu'est-ce que c'est or ok in Portuguese. It's just u вас есть, you have, which is kind of easy. But they can shift the words around in the order because of the case system. And now I'm going to spend a little time on the three big bugbears in Russian, the three major problems that you have to overcome. The cases, the second one is verbs of motion, and the third one is the aspect of verbs. Everything else kind of you can get used to. But those three I'm still struggling with. So this video I can see is going to be a little bit longer than the others, but nevertheless, I hope it's worthwhile. Cases. Some people don't know what cases are. I had Latin at school. We had to decline, bellum as fast as possible. Blum, 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 blee, blum, 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 blee, blah, 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 blum, please, please. Those are the singular and plural 6 cases of the Latin noun bellum, meaning war, bellum, or however it's pronounced. In Russian, there are 6 cases, not the same. Latin has the vocative, which the Russians don't have, although the Czechs do. The cases, the concept is quite straightforward. In other words, if a noun is the subject of a sentence, I go, the book is on the table, then it's in the nominative. If you do something to the book, I give the book to you, I give the book, now the book is in the accusative because you've done something to it. If I give the book to you, I've been giving it to you, dative, to donation, give, that's the dative. Then they have a thing called the prepositional case, which is basically where something is, on the, at the, in the, sort of like a location type case. In that case, the noun will have a different ending. And then they have, what have I forgot? The genitive, which means to belong to something. So, of the book. Of the book would be in the genitive. And they have a thing called the instrumental. By the book, by my pen, or anything that implies what instrument, what was the agent that you used to do something. In that case, I went by car. Then the car will be in the instrumental. So those are the cases. There are 6 cases. The endings, for example, u might be the accusative for the feminine. It might be the dative for the masculine and neuter. So the endings kind of shift around, which doesn't help. And of course you have masculine, neuter, and feminine. So you got all kinds of different endings that you have to learn. That starts to become a problem. The problem with the cases is that as a general overview, the concept is not difficult. But the specific, explanations of why we use one case or another are extremely confusing. And if I were to read you from this book here, picked out, for every case, there are like a variety, the genitive case is used after words expressing measure and quantity. That's fine. But if it's one of something, it's the nominative singular. If it's 2, 3, or 4 of something, it's the genitive singular. If it's 5 or more, it's the genitive plural. Now, if that was the only rule you had to learn, you could probably deal with it. But there's lots more. The genitive case is used in a partitive sense to express an indefinite incomplete quantity. Okay, good for you. And you go on, if you go on to the accusative, it's the genitive case is normally used after negated verbs in the following instances: when the negation is intensified by another word, when a partitive sentence is negated, all this stuff. of course, I don't know what that means, but I have to look at the examples. You know, what are we? You know, the dative is used to express the logical side, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it just goes on and on. A, B, C, D, F, G, whatever, H. And, you know, like the vast majority of prepositions don't take the prepositional case, they take the genitive case. And the same preposition will sometimes take the genitive and sometimes take the accusative. And so it's extremely difficult. And the endings, the tables, I've looked at those tables so many times. And you can kind of half remember it for a day or two, and then it's gone. And even if you understand the explanations, after lots of examples, and I should say that this grammar book with all of its explanations, I always use as an example of how horrible grammar explanations can be. I have another book that I bought in Moscow, which just has examples. And if with enough examples, you can start to see it. However, what I've found is, ultimately, you just have to read and listen so often that certain phrases start to sound natural with their endings. It was much like learning tones in Chinese. Trying to remember the individual tone for each character was very difficult. But with enough practice, you eventually get better and better. Okay? And I'll just digress a bit. I am a big proponent of lots of listening and reading, but to get good, eventually you have to do a lot of speaking. I have done a lot of speaking in Japanese, in French, even in Chinese, because I used to go to China, you know, a month a year when I was in Hong Kong, attending the Hong Kong or the Canton Trade Fair, speaking Chinese all the time. I've spoken a lot of Chinese. I haven't spoken a lot of Russian, so I speak still with a lot of hesitation and mistakes. Eventually, you got to speak a lot, but you have to also continue listening and reading. So, cases, that's number one. You're always, in my view, going to have trouble with the cases. Perhaps someone who attends a class, who's studying it formally, maybe does better than I did. I was spending an hour a day, most of it in my car while exercising, listening. It was, you know, it's an interest thing. I'm not passing a test. However, I must say that given that I spent 5 years at it, an hour a day, a lot of people study it very seriously in class and they don't get as far along as I did. And besides which, I can understand so much. And this is another thing. When you don't understand or you don't know the cases, it doesn't prevent you from understanding if you have the words. Some things remain a little bit fuzzy, but it's sufficiently redundant. The whole context is that you can still understand, learn words on Link, where I learned all my words, and enjoy the language, learn about the country, the culture, and even though you haven't really nailed down the grammar. And what I tended to do was I had listened to simple stuff to begin with, and then I went to more difficult stuff. Someone asked me on one of my YouTube videos, is it worthwhile listening to stuff you don't understand? No. Get stuff where you can access the text. If you can access the text, the transcript, bring it into Link as I did, save the words and phrases, and that way you will eventually be able to understand more and more of it. Anyway, that was cases. The second issue is verbs of motion. In Russian, there's the word to go in English. I go tomorrow, I always go. Not in Russian. Aside from the fact that the verbs have tenses and change for tense and change for person, okay, that's a minor problem. Bigger problem is if you go what they call multi-directional, if you kind of go all the time or go and come back, that's one verb. But if you are going there, that's another verb. And if you go on a means of transportation, that's another verb. And that also has its multi-directional and unidirectional form. And that's just for go. And then there's carry and come and fly and swim. Very difficult to get a handle on and to actually be able to reproduce. It doesn't prevent you from understanding the language, but it is very difficult to nail it down when you're speaking. And then we have the aspect of verbs. And I have read these definitions so many times. It's if the action is completed or was supposed to be completed or might have been completed or was never going to be completed, then you use one form. But if in fact it was completed or might have been completed, and except for the other exceptions, then you use this other form. I don't understand it. I've read them so many times. And here again, it's just exposure, and eventually, because you can't be trying to go through all these logical explanations while you're speaking. So to my mind, you have to expose yourself to a lot of the language and then eventually start speaking a lot, okay? I could get into other issues that are different, but they're minor, like, you know, the word for, like, in where, okay? где, where, but in Russian there's also, from where to where are actually different words. Those are minor issues. The big problems in Russian are those three bugbears: cases, verbs of motion, and aspects of verbs. Now, the good news. Russian is fascinating. It's a beautiful language. The country is fascinating. Their culture and history is fascinating. The people who appear kind of somewhat stoic, in fact, are very warm, and they tend to speak their minds and say what they think, and don't worry too much about the details. But that's what makes them so fun to be around. And I would say too that there is this in Russia, there's no compromise. And I think that's how they approach even artistic creation or sports. And that's why we see a lot of artistic creation in Russia. Outstanding ballerinas, outstanding musicians, or whatever, scientists. And even in sport, certainly in hockey, I find the Russians are just magicians. They're artists. And so they have a tendency to really commit themselves in one direction. They're not fence sitters. So, with that, I'm sorry that I ran for so long. I could speak forever on the subject. It's been a big part of my life the last 5 years, although the last 7, but the last 2 I was more on Czech and Romanian and Portuguese and whatnot. It's been a big part of the last, since my 60th birthday, and will continue to be so. And I very much encourage you to learn Russian despite the difficulties. Thank you for listening.